It was May 2016 that Nvidia launched the Geforce GTX 1080 and its smaller brother the Geforce GTX 1070. Powered by Nvidia's PASCAL architecture, the cards represented at the time the pinnacle of performance. My name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be doing a retrospective of the GTX 1080 now that it's 3 years old. We're going to be examining why it's still so popular with gamers today, but also why the card was so important when it launched all that time ago. I'd also like to thank, however, before we jump into the video, MSI for providing us the Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard that we're conducting our tests on, as well as Deepcool for the AIO that we're using. Nvidia's CEO Jensen Huang announced the card at a special event held about 3 weeks prior to the launch of PASCAL. The GTX 1080, according to Jensen, carried irresponsible levels of performance, and frankly, it wasn't hard to see why he made this claim. Nvidia's own marketing material reported that the GTX 1080 was about 70% faster than its predecessor, the GTX 980, putting it closer in fact to two 980s in SLI. This meant it stomped the Geforce GTX 980 Ti and essentially carved out an entire new performance tier for itself. Nvidia's entire focus for PASCAL was to get as much raw performance out of the cards as possible. They shifted from the 28nm process used for MAXWELL, and Nvidia now leveraged TSMC's 16nm FinFET process. The core measured just 314mm squared, despite containing about 2 billion more transistors than the 5.2 billion inside the 398mm squared die of the GTX 980. The card required about 15 watts more power though, which meant the reference TDP of the card was 165 watts, so a single 8-pin power connector was required to feed it. PASCAL also saw the first implementation of GDDR5X, and while today GDDR6 replaces 5X in just about every way conceivable, for 2016 GDDR5X gave a great shot in the arm to memory bandwidth. 5X was reserved initially for just the GTX 1080. Remember, the 1070 used the slower R5, but eventually the GTX 1080 Ti also made use of R5X as well. Similarly, Nvidia took steps to increase memory compression, and so combined with R5X memory, now also bumped up to 8GB of memory compared to just 4GB of the 980, memory constraints for PASCAL were largely eliminated. The GPU core architecture received a significant makeover too. For one, the design of the cards were tweaked to allow the 2560 CUDA cores to crank frequencies way north of over 1700 MHz. For context, this board advertised boost frequencies of the 1080 about 500 MHz faster than its predecessor, the GTX 980. Nvidia implemented Boost 3.0 for PASCAL. I've already put out a video of what Boost does and how it behaves, so you can check that out if you want. But the gist of it here is that Boost 3 allows finer grained control over frequencies and has better control over the power being fed to the card compared to MAXWELL's Boost 2.0. In reality then, the 1733 MHz advertised boost frequency is often regularly surpassed, providing you have decent airflow and so on. The SM design for PASCAL was also tweaked, with improvements to compute preemption and also dynamic scheduling. There's a lot more Nvidia did to the underlying architecture, but this is just not an video focused on a full technical analysis of PASCAL. But the key takeaway is that Nvidia largely fixed the weaknesses MAXWELL had, such as asynchronous compute and bandwidth issues, all while cranking up the clock frequencies. Nvidia launched the 1080 at $700 for the Founders Edition, while the bulk standard reference model cost you $100 less. The 10 series were the first cards from Nvidia to introduce the Founders Edition models, and their introduction was taken with a mixture of enthusiasm and dislike, the latter being particularly true from AIBs if you believe the rumours. In 2017, March, Nvidia did the inevitable and launched the GTX 1080 Ti, and also announced a simultaneous price cut for the 1080. This was a super smart move by Nvidia, and as you can imagine, prompted the surge of sales for the card. But now let's get an idea of how the card performs today by looking at some benchmarks. We're going to use a combination of newer titles as well as slightly older ones so we can see just how the cards evolved over time and also test across a plethora of different resolutions. As you can see from our tests, 1440p largely poses no problem whatsoever for the GTX 1080, which is very impressive given the card is, well, 3 years old. Concessions would likely need to be made with certain titles though at 4K, but even so, the results here are very respectable. And now we're going to look at several titles where we manually run through the game. So these results are going to focus primarily on 1440p with the exception of the original Crysis where we're going to run that at 4K. We will also look at max, average as well as 1% minimum frame rates. Wolfenstein, much like Resident Evil 2, absolutely loves memory, and so the 4GB of the GTX 980 caused lots of issues at the 1% min. The GTX 1080 though chugs along rather lovely. Now getting to Resident Evil 2, it is a beautiful looking game and runs well across lots of hardware. We have lowered the texture quality though for these tests because otherwise the GTX 980's performance was so bad that it just didn't make any sense, so the choice was either to lower the texture setting or to just not include the GTX 980. So there you have it then. It's not very frequently you can consider a piece of hardware a good investment. There are some notable exceptions. If you have, for example, an i7-4770K, it's still a pretty good gaming processor. In fact, we actually tested this just recently. And there are other CPUs that you can make the same argument with. On the GPU side, there have been also several standouts. The Voodoo 2, particularly if you had a pair in SLI, the Radeon 9800 Pro, the Geforce 8800 GTX was an absolute monster and was relevant for many years after its release. But I think now we can add the Geforce GTX 1080 to that list. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but if you bought one of these cards at launch, you must be pretty darn pleased with yourself because you can still crank the settings to basically max in any title at 1440p. At 4K, the story is a little bit different, with some very demanding games such as The Witcher 3 as well as Metro Exodus putting an extreme load on the card, so you would either need to turn down the resolution, be happy to play at a lower frame rate, or of course turn the quality settings down. But come on now, the GPU is 3 years old and it still remains incredibly impressive. For owners of a 1440p display though, who are not aiming for 144Hz or above, you can definitely hold on to PASCAL until either AMD's higher-end Radeon SKUs come out or Nvidia's 7nm die shrink. Oh, and I guess you also can't forget that Intel's Xe line of cards hit shelves next year too. The next 12 months in graphics will be very interesting. Having said all of that, in computing, you can always wait until the next release. If you want to pump as many frames per second into a high refresh rate 1440p monitor, or you want to shift to a new shiny 4K display, then your GTX 1080 may just not be enough now. So the question is, should you upgrade? And the answer to that question is, of course, is your current hardware doing what you want it to do? The GTX 1080 was so impressive because not only did we see a large shrink in process from 28nm down to 16nm FinFET, but also a brand new architecture and much faster memory to boot. Nvidia had promised a 70% increase in performance with the 1080 compared to that of the 980, and well, they were not kidding, they hit this target. The RTX 2080 in contrast was only around 40% faster than the GTX 1080 with traditional rasterized performance. Don't misconstrue what I'm saying. 40% increase in performance is nothing to be sneezed at. There are definitely core improvements to Turing that were very much appreciated. The shift to GDDR6 memory was definitely well received. Variable rate shading is pretty awesome. Simultaneous floating point and integer execution definitely has lots of potential with certain titles. Further improvements to memory compression and lots of other stuff provides a solid backbone for the architecture. And I do quite like ray tracing. And I even feel that DLSS has promise. Indeed, tensor cores can be used for lots of other stuff too, such as potentially AI. But I think it's the execution of the release of Turing that was the problem, rather than the architecture of Turing itself. If you are looking for a card though with some professional acceleration, Turing is noticeably faster than PASCAL, and we've actually looked at this in the past. But I suspect that RTX 20 series launch was a lesson learnt by Nvidia, and with any luck, we'll see them execute the Geforce 30 series much better than they did with Geforce 20. To the company's credit though, the Super series of cards has improved performance quite a bit, particularly the 2070 Super, and if these had been the cards at launch, I imagine Turing would have been received much more favourably. But, in the here and now, the GTX 1080 remains a fantastic card and shows that when Nvidia get things just right, they are capable of releasing a truly incredible product. This isn't to say I would suggest rushing out and buying a 1080 now. As of the time I'm recording this, they are holding their value very well on eBay, and frankly for that money I would much rather you buy Turing or an RDNA card. But that may also be great for you if you're thinking of selling your card, or maybe if you can buy one from your friend Tom at a decent price. If you're the owner of a GTX 1080 or other PASCAL card, I'm curious to hear what your plans are, so definitely tell me in the comments below. Are you going to see what happens from AMD's higher end GPUs in terms of their performance, or instead are you waiting for Nvidia and the inevitable 7nm GPUs from them next year, or maybe even to see what Intel are capable of with its XE line of cards, which also is going to launch next year. I get the feeling next year is going to be a really crazy time. But with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed this retrospective in video. If you did, then, well, you know what to do. You click the like button because that helps us out a lot, and also maybe share it around to your friends and on social media. You can also subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so, and you can find us, of course, linked on social media, which is found in the description of the video, right down there. That's it. Clicked it. Good. And you can also find us on Patreon as well as Amazon affiliate links if you so desire to use them. That's totally up to you. And there's also a Green Man Gaming affiliate link as well. GMG, by the way, are completely reputable. They team up with publishers such as Bethesda, Capcom, Sega, so on and so on. So if you decide to purchase a new game via one of those, it gives us a few pennies. Once again, don't feel you have to, but if you want to support the channel, then that's one way to do so. But I wish you an amazing day. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.